After 4 months of heavy fighting, German commander Paulus and his troops still found themselves engaged in intense battles with Soviet forces for control of the city. 300,000 German soldiers had pinned down the last Soviet defenders to a narrow strip of land along the river Volga. Bloodied and exhausted, the remains of the Red Army stubbornly refused to give up the ground their comrades had bled and died for. Losing it would mean losing their last remaining foothold in the city. For Paulus, as long as Soviet resistance continued, he knew his army remained vulnerable and at risk of being trapped deep inside Russia. But for Hitler and the Nazi propaganda machine, the battle was won. He had secured another great victory against Stalin.
It's being proclaimed in the German press that they pretty much captured the city, and there's famous shots of the Sixth Army raising the flags in the centre of town to say that's exactly what they've done. But what they're not saying is the enemy, the Red Army, is still controlling small pockets of the city, only 100 metres, 150 metres in depth at various points, but they're still there in the city. They still have to be defeated, and despite all efforts, they still can't be shifted.
The Soviet troops were led by 2 men, Deputy Supreme Commander Zhukov and Field Commander Vasily Chukov. Chukov, who had been based in the heart of the city throughout the battle, now found himself pushed back to just 800 meters from the banks of the Volga. The 50,000 remaining Soviet troops were now confronted by a series of vicious German assaults. These attacks aimed to destroy the remaining Soviet positions and force them back across the Volga and out of the city. The most intense fighting took place in the tractor plant and Barricadi factory, huge industrial complexes that provided ample cover for the Soviet defenders, whilst leaving the approaching German troops dangerously exposed. Savage fighting raged back and forth, until finally German attackers wrested control of the factories from the Soviets. Despite suffering devastating losses, Chukov was under strict orders by Zhukov to hold his position at all costs. What he didn't know was that his superiors were planning something that would change the battle and the war.
Zhukov knew that the Russian armed forces had an advantage here in Stalingrad. It didn't just know the town, it knew how to fight this style of war.
The moment that Zhukov is made Deputy Supreme Commander, he's already thinking big. He's thinking about big encirclements. And what comes together are 2 plans. So there is a massive counterattack being planned for around the Moscow front, which is Jupiter and Mars, and then there is a monster counterattack plan for the whole Don front and the Stalingrad front, which is Uranus and Saturn.
What Zhukov and Stalin were planning was a series of top-secret encirclements. Codenamed after the planets, the first was Operation Uranus, designed to encircle and trap Paulus and the Sixth Army in the ruins of Stalingrad by smashing through the Romanian and Italian Axis troops stationed on his flanks. It would be followed by Operation Saturn, a counter-offensive aiming to enlarge the area now controlled by the Soviet Army. Operation Uranus was vast. It called upon over 1 million Soviet troops, 804 tanks, 13,400 artillery pieces, and over 1,000 aircraft. Planned in total secrecy, not even Chukov, leading on the front line, knew what was coming. Soviet success relied on catching the Germans and their allies off guard. It would call upon all of Zhukov's experience as a military planner.
Zhukov is really skilled at coordinating huge quantities of absolutely everything you need for a war. So he is an absolute master of bringing together artillery and logistics. He would bring together air support, land support, and direct huge volumes of tanks.
Huge armies are just being born out of nothing.
Степью по берегам Волги шли к Сталинграду войска. Верховное главнокомандование формировало резервы для перехода в контрнаступление.
They're just emerging, fully formed, sort of uniformed, kitted out with rifles and guns and artillery and tanks. It's sort of like Sauron producing orc armies. I mean, it is quite extraordinary.
The planning of Uranus typifies Zhukov's hands-on, practical approach to leadership and the advantage it had over the detached, intellectual style of Paulus.
I think Zhukov knew that this battle was going to be decisive. It was going to be a major tipping point in how Russia engaged with Germany. Stakes were really high here. Zhukov has seen military experience at all levels. He went through the ranks, so he had a much broader experience than some of his generals, particularly the newer, less experienced ones. And this really informs the way that he participates in war. He's close to the front, he's close to his men, he's close to his actions, he's not hiding in political offices.
The thing you've got to remember about Paulus is he's leading the Sixth Army from way back behind the lines. Paulus was never on the front line until the bitter end when he surrendered.
In the early hours of the 19th of November, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Beginning at 07:20 Moscow time, Soviet forces began with a huge assault on the Axis troops protecting Paulus's northern flank. Zhukov's troops broke through the Axis lines, completely wiping out 2 Romanian armies. The next day, further devastating attacks were launched on Paulus's southern flank.
20 ноября. Перешли в наступление войска Сталинградского фронта. Все шло строго по намеченному плану. Вперед! Только вперед! Сколько советских бойцов осталось навечно в Волжской степи. Но живые продвигались вперед.
This huge counter-offensive was like nothing the Germans had ever seen before. It caught Paulus and his men totally off guard.
This is huge. I mean, in total, amassed around that area and around that front, Zhukov now has 1.1 million men. It's just a huge force, and 190,000 men earmarked specifically for Uranus.
So Zhukov again brings in his signature move of coordinating these huge volumes of men, artillery, logistics, and huge quantities of reserves at the back as well. And he is ready for this fight. The average German soldier would have just had no idea what was coming for them. They were not prepared for this.
Фронт прорыва становится все шире. В него устремляются массы нашей конницы.
Well, within 3 days, Soviet forces under Zhukov had achieved the impossible. They'd surrounded the Sixth Army and their allies.
330 тысяч фашистских солдат в кольце окружения.
It wasn't a kind of surrounding of just the city, it was the hinterland too. It ran for 50-odd kilometres to the north and south. It was a big area that Paulus's forces were now defending.
The encirclement was absolutely ruthless, and Zhukov didn't just trap this army, he absolutely annihilated it. And this was unheard of for Germany during this war.
Operation Uranus is launched, and Paulus, in the field, knows this is a huge threat to his army. He knows this could be absolutely cataclysmic. He contacts Hitler and he says, I need to punch out of this, I need to get out of this. Hitler's response is, you're not doing that. You are going to stay put, and I can send people to save you. Don't worry about that.
By the 22nd of November, the encirclement was complete.
Чтобы вызволить окруженную группировку, гитлеровцы бросили в наступление группу армий Дон. Но враг был остановлен и отброшен от Сталинградского котла.
All Paulus could do was stabilize his army's position and establish defensive lines to secure the area they now found themselves trapped in. An area that soon became known as the Stalingrad Kessel, or the Cauldron.
Zhukov and Stalin think that they're going to catch around perhaps 90,000 men on a good day. In actual fact, it's more like 250, 275,000. It's a lot more than they think. And it is entirely Hitler's fault.
The scale of what happened at Stalingrad is unimaginable to armies today. Soldiers were moved from different fronts, reserves were brought in. This is an overwhelming volume of soldiers.
Hitler faced a dangerous dilemma. Immediate defeat in Stalingrad would leave both Army Group Don and Army Group A cut off and at risk of destruction by the huge Soviet armies now advancing from the east. But retreat from the Caucasus would mean abandoning the oil fields that the German army so desperately needed.
Hitler has just no idea of sensible military tactics. If you're going to find yourself with any risk of being encircled, get out straight away. Hitler is too fascinated, obsessed with prestige and honour to withdraw. And he keeps saying, you generals, all you ever want to do is withdraw, withdraw, withdraw. That's not how you win the war. Ultimately, you win by conserving your men and your equipment. What you don't do is risk allowing 220,000 men to be encircled in the snow a very, very long way from home.
Paulus has seen the writing on the wall. He can see what's about to happen. There is an opportunity for them to pull back from Stalingrad, but that's not Hitler's way.
Hitler's instinct was he didn't want to lose Stalingrad. He'd already announced he'd captured Stalingrad, and he knew strategically it was an important place to be. He didn't want to retreat from there, but he knew the danger the army was in. And so he believed people like Goering, who were saying to him, my Luftwaffe can resupply any army that's trapped. And so that was almost Hitler's get-out clause. He wanted to believe the impossible could be done.
Hitler agreed with Goering's plan to supply Paulus and his army from the air. Goering had assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe was capable of flying in the required 750 tons of supplies a day. This was a lie. Both he and Hitler had been warned by their own staff that this was impossible. With few supplies reaching the trapped forces, starvation quickly set in amongst the men of the beleaguered Sixth Army.
One of the reasons why Hitler's completely unrealistic about what's going on is because Goering comes along and says, it's all right, the Luftwaffe can supply Paulus with an airlift, it's not a problem. But again, this is insane thinking. Why does Hitler listen to Goering? Goering is the man who has never really delivered on any of his promises. But he does listen to him and he goes, great, well, there's an airlift, that'll be fine. What does that ignore? The fact is, the winter is not going to be very friendly to aircraft. Ailerons get iced up, you've got freezing fog, you've got everything that makes flying in 1942 difficult.
Most of Paulus's men would not die as a result of fighting, but from malnutrition and hypothermia. Wounded soldiers who were lucky enough to be flown out rarely reached home. Hitler's generals, fearing what the sight of the starving men would do to public morale, transported them to military hospitals outside of Germany.
Paulus has got his own commanders telling him, do we break out? At this early point of the encirclement, they recognise militarily that this is the best chance they've got. Try and break the encirclement before they're hermetically sealed in by stronger and increasingly stronger Soviet besiegers.
The more precarious Paulus's situation is, the more entrenched Hitler becomes that there can be no turning round. So suddenly you've got a situation where you've got Stalin going, there can be no retreats, and you've got Hitler going, there can be no retreats. So you've got this clash which is only going to end one way.
On the 27th of November, a message from Hitler was broadcast to German troops trapped in Stalingrad. The battle for Stalingrad is approaching its climax. The enemy has broken through into the rear of the German forces. In these difficult hours, my thoughts and those of the whole German nation are with you. You must, under all circumstances, under the command of your generals, hold Stalingrad, which you have conquered with so much blood. The message was clear. Paulus and his men were to stand fast.
He's been told to stay where he is, but that doesn't stop him making the plea or making the argument or the case to his Supreme Commander, can I break out? This is the plan we have, Operation Thunderclap it was called. Being Paulus, it's very detailed. This is how our forces are going to break out. I know we've got over 300,000 men. I know we've got all this material in terms of armoured forces, motorised forces, trucks, over 50,000 horses. We know we're going to lose the bulk of this, pushing through the Russian winter to get back to our lines and fighting our way out. But at this early juncture, we could probably still do.
Paulus's requests to break out were denied. The Sixth Army was to hold their position.
Now that the encirclement has happened, it's a reality, and Hitler also realises that the Luftwaffe just can't get through in the numbers required to keep Paulus supplied. The mood in HQ is absolutely at rock bottom. I mean, Hitler still tries to project this outward feeling of confidence, but actually he admits that he's not sleeping well. He knows this is going to be potentially a complete disaster. You know, you've got nearly 250,000 men right there, trapped and starving. Those around him, high command, they know this is a parlous situation. And of course, Paulus is always kind of radioing in and saying, please let me break out. I think I can do it. I think I can escape. And Hitler is going, no. You've got to stay there. You've got to stay firm. You've got to fight to the last man and the last bullet. Why is Hitler organising this last stand that's utterly pointless and pitiful? Because it's all about prestige and not about military joined-up thinking. You know, for Hitler, it is better to lose 250,000 men in a kind of hopeless battle than it is for these men to withdraw. You know, this makes no military sense, but in Hitler's twisted thinking, it kind of makes political sense for him. There's a glory in death. There's a glory in an army being destroyed, fighting for the good of the Third Reich.
Paulus is kind of being let down by his Supreme Commander. There's a lot of criticism Paulus got after the Second World War about he was too timid, he should have taken the initiative and got his army out of there. He kind of did want to, but he was still a man who would follow his mission and follow his orders. And if his own direct commander, which is Manstein, saying to him, we are having these discussions about how we could break out if we want to break out, I will let you know as soon as I know. I will be discussing it with Hitler at Supreme Headquarters. But Manstein was never going to give him that order.
Finally, on the 12th of December, nearly a month after Paulus and his troops were encircled, Hitler agreed to launch a relief